I remember the exact moment my world changed, though at first I didn't know it. It wasn't during a gunfight or a midnight ambush. It was quieter than that. Just a horse on the horizon, and the sun dipping low across the prairie, setting fire to the sky. I had been waiting 3 long months for Margaret, the gentle schoolteacher I had promised myself to, the woman whose letters spoke of kindness and a life built on faith and patience. But when that rider crested the ridge, what I saw was not the woman from those letters. She dismounted like someone who had carried a weapon longer than she'd carried trust. Dust clung to her boots, and I noticed something else almost immediately. Blood. Fresh, wet, and dark against worn leather. She said her name was Margaret, but I knew in my bones she wasn't. Margaret would have arrived with books, maybe a ribbon in her hair, not a revolver strapped to her side, and eyes so sharp they seemed to cut through every lie I'd ever told myself. I didn't reach for my rifle then. Instinct told me she was dangerous, but instinct also told me that if she meant me harm, I'd already be dead. What unsettled me most wasn't her weapon or her false claim. It was the way she looked at me, as if she already knew me. Knew things I'd never put in those letters, the scar on my shoulder, the coffee I drank every dawn, even the way I favored my left knee when the cold came in. Things no stranger had any right to know. I'd been waiting for Margaret. But what I got instead was Dixie Hargrove. And with her came trouble that would change everything I thought I knew about justice, trust, and survival out here on the edge of civilization. If you're still listening, don't turn away now. Because what I'm about to tell you is the kind of story you won't forget. One of blood, betrayal, and the choice between running from danger or standing your ground no matter the cost. I tried to convince myself she might still be Margaret, that the dust and the gun and the blood were just tricks of circumstance. But deep down I knew better. The woman standing on my porch had the posture of a fighter, not a teacher. She didn't ask politely to come in. She scanned the horizon first, her hand hovering near the revolver on her hip, like she expected death to follow her every step. I watched her wipe the blood from her boot against my wooden step as if it were nothing more than mud. That tiny gesture told me more than any words could. She had walked in blood before, enough times that it no longer unsettled her. And I realized in that moment, whoever she wasn't new to violence. In the distance, I noticed 3 riders cresting the hill, moving steady like wolves on a scent. She noticed them too. For the first time since her arrival, I caught a flash of fear across her face. Not the kind of fear that makes a person run, but the kind that makes them bare their teeth and get ready to fight. That's when the truth began to unravel. She wasn't Margaret. She was someone else entirely, someone with enemies, and those enemies had followed her right to my doorstep. My closest neighbor was 15 miles away. The sheriff was a ghost. Whatever storm she carried, I was the only one standing in its path. I could have sent her away right then, could have told her my land wasn't a refuge. But when I saw how she squared her shoulders, ready to face down men who outnumbered her, I felt something unexpected. A pull. Not of love, not yet, but of loyalty to someone who refused to bow to fear. That was the first step toward the choice that would define my life. The riders came closer, their silhouettes cutting sharp against the horizon, rifles glinting in the dying sun. I could almost hear the leather of their saddles creak, the steady rhythm of hooves carrying intent I didn't yet understand. That's when she finally spoke a name that wasn't hers. Dixie Hargrove. The sound of it hit me like a hammer. It wasn't Margaret's gentle schoolteacher name. It was a name that belonged to someone who had lived with danger breathing down her neck. I didn't know what crimes she'd committed, or what crimes had been committed against her, but I did know one thing. Those riders weren't here for tea and conversation. Trouble had followed her to my land, and now I was standing in the middle of it. I had 2 choices. Close my door and pray they rode past, or take up my rifle and face whatever storm was rolling in. Most men would have turned her away. Out here, survival meant minding your own business. But I'd lived too long with silence, in these hills with only the wind and the cattle for company. When she crouched behind my water trough like she'd scouted the place a dozen times before, I realized something. She had been watching this land, maybe me, for longer than I knew. That unsettled me, but it also sparked a dangerous thought. If she knew my routines, my scars, my coffee habits, then her being here wasn't chance. It was design, and design meant I'd already been chosen, whether I liked it or not. When my hand closed around my rifle, I surprised myself, not by the act of arming, but by the word that slipped unbidden into my thoughts. We, as in, how much time do we have before those riders are on us? The moment I accepted that we, there was no turning back. They called her name before I even had a chance to steady my rifle. Not Margaret, but Dixie. The sound of it carried across the open land, sharp and cruel. The kind of voice that belonged to a man who enjoyed watching others flinch. I saw her jaw tighten, her shoulders stiffen, but she didn't move. She didn't need to. Their words told me everything. She wasn't running from shadows. She was running from flesh and blood men who had hunted her across miles. The one in front had a scar that carved his face into something ugly, a mark that made his grin look more like a wound. He promised her a quick end if she surrendered, but his eyes told a different story. Men like that didn't grant mercy. They erased problems, and right then, I was just as much a problem as she was. That was the moment I stopped pretending I could stay out of it. These men weren't chasing her because of some petty feud. They were chasing her to bury a truth too dangerous to breathe in daylight. And when I looked at Dixie, crouched and ready to meet death head-on, I saw someone who wasn't just fighting for her life. She was fighting for something bigger, something worth dying over. I should have felt anger at being dragged into it. Instead, I felt something else. Resolve. I had lived alone long enough to know that if I shut my door now, I'd spend the rest of my days haunted by what I hadn't done. So I stepped out into the open, my rifle leveled, my voice carrying across the dirt. This was my land. Whatever fight they wanted, they'd have to spill my blood to get it. In that moment, the lines were drawn, Dixie on one side, hunted but unbroken. The scarred man and his riders on the other, ready to kill to keep their secrets buried. And me, caught between them, but no longer an outsider. I had chosen my place in the storm. The standoff didn't last long. Out here, men didn't waste breath when bullets could speak louder. The scarred one lifted his hand and the riders fanned out, circling like wolves around a cornered deer. My trigger finger tightened, my breath steadying the way it always did before a shot. But it wasn't me who fired first. It was Dixie. Her revolver cleared leather with a speed that didn't seem possible for someone who'd just ridden half the territory with death on her heels. The first rider dropped before his horse even understood it was riderless. That crack of gunfire tore the stillness apart, and then the world was nothing but thunder, hooves pounding, guns blazing, shouts and curses ripped raw from men who thought they were hunters but had just discovered their prey had fangs. I fired not to kill at first, but to scatter them to buy her seconds. But Dixie wasn't aiming to scatter. She was aiming to end it. Every shot of hers was measured, deliberate, as if she'd counted bullets and enemies long before she rode into my life. I should have been afraid of her then. This stranger who claimed a false name and fought like she'd lived in blood since childhood. But instead I felt a grim sort of pride. Whoever she wasn't broken. She wasn't bowing. The scarred man didn't fall. He stayed back, letting his riders take the bullets meant for him. When the dust began to clear, 2 of his men lay silent in the dirt, another crawling and bleeding, and still, he grinned. That scar twisting, making his face a mask of cruelty. He wasn't here just to kill her. He wanted something else. And when his eyes shifted from her to me, I realized he knew it too. I wasn't just caught in Dixie's storm anymore. I was now a piece on their board, and they meant to use me. When the smoke thinned and silence pressed heavy on the land, I half expected the scarred man to charge. Instead, he pulled his reins and held back, studying us like a predator weighing patience against hunger. His men gathered what was left of their wounded, but he didn't ride away. No, he lingered, grinning that split-faced grin before finally tipping his hat and promising he'd return by sundown tomorrow. Then they rode off, leaving the smell of gunpowder and blood in the dirt. I lowered my rifle, my arms aching, but my eyes stayed on Dixie. She hadn't flinched, not once, not even when the lead flew close enough to cut the air beside her cheek. She holstered her revolver with the calm of someone tying their boots at dawn, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she looked at me like I'd earned the truth. "They're not after me because of who I am," she said. "They're after me because of what I know." Her voice was steady, but the words struck harder than gunfire. I asked what she meant, though part of me already feared the answer. She spoke of names, men in high places who wore badges by day and spilled blood by night, running cattle and whiskey through counties like kings ruling over peasants. She'd seen it. She had proof. And the scarred man wasn't just some outlaw. He was the hand of those men sent to silence her before she reached anyone willing to listen. That's when I understood the danger wasn't passing. It was rooted deep, like a thorn under skin. By sheltering her, I hadn't just chosen a side in a gunfight. I'd chosen a side in a war most folks didn't even know was being fought. And as she fixed me with those sharp eyes, she asked the question that would bind my fate tighter than any bullet. "Will you stand with me when they come back?" Her words hung between us like smoke after a fire. "Will you stand with me when they come back?" I wanted to say no. Wanted to tell her this wasn't my fight, that I hadn't asked for it and didn't deserve the storm she carried. But the truth clawed at me. I'd already answered the moment I pulled the trigger beside her. I spent that night walking the perimeter of my land, lantern in one hand, rifle in the other, weighing every choice I'd made. My father used to say, a man's worth wasn't measured by the land he owned, but by the line he chose to hold. And here I was, with a stranger's war spilling into my yard, deciding whether I'd hold or run. Dixie didn't waste time with doubt. While I wrestled with my conscience, she was setting snares along the creek bed, moving with a precision that told me she'd been hunted before. I watched her from the porch, the moonlight catching in her hair, and I realized she wasn't waiting for my answer. She already knew I'd stand. Maybe she'd known from the first moment she laid eyes on me. Inside, I laid out ammunition, cleaned the rifle twice over, and sharpened the hunting knife I hadn't drawn in years. The silence between us wasn't cold. It was heavy with purpose. Every scrape of steel, every click of metal was a vow neither of us dared put into words. By dawn, the ranch looked less like a home and more like a fortress. My chest felt hollow, but my hands were steady. Because the truth was clear. If I let her face them alone, I'd be no better than the men who hunted her. And if I stood with her, well, I'd likely be dead before the week was out. But death didn't scare me half as much as the thought of living a coward. The day dragged on like a hanging clock, each tick louder than the last. I fixed fences that didn't need fixing, tightened saddle straps twice over, anything to keep my hands busy. Dixie, though, she sat calm beneath the cottonwood, oiling her revolver with the care of a preacher polishing a Bible. It was the quiet, before the storm, and both of us knew it. As the sun began to slide west, I finally asked the question burning in me since the first shot rang out. "Why here? Why me?" She looked up, her eyes sharp as flint but softened by something I hadn't seen before, regret. "Because you're not like the rest," she said. "Men like you don't bend easy. I read it in your letters, Wade. Every word told me you weren't waiting on Margaret because you were lonely. You were waiting because you believed in something better than this broken land." Her words cut deep, because they were true. I had bared myself in those letters, shared dreams I never spoke aloud, and she'd used that truth to walk straight into my life. Part of me wanted to hate her for it. But another part, the louder part, knew she was right. If I hadn't been the man she thought I was, I would have already turned her away. The horizon glowed red as if the earth itself was bleeding, and I knew the scarred man would come soon. Dixie slipped her revolver back into its holster, then met my gaze with a steadiness that settled the storm inside me. "They think fear makes men weak," she said, "but fear only matters if you stand alone." For the first time, I felt the weight lift, not because the danger had lessened, but because we were no longer two strangers tied by chance. We were allies bound by choice. And when the dust rose on the horizon once more, I realized I wasn't afraid of dying. I was afraid of failing her. The wind shifted just as the first shot rang out, carrying dust and the acrid smell of gunpowder across my land. I grabbed my rifle and ran for the porch, heart hammering, as Dixie moved with the fluidity of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. The scarred man and his riders weren't testing us anymore. They were attacking. The first rider came at a reckless angle, hoping to surprise, but Dixie's shot stopped him mid-stride. Another screamed as the bullet tore through his shoulder, and I fired into the chaos, barely recognizing the sound of my own rifle. This was no longer about letters waiting or dreams of companionship. This was survival, pure and brutal. I caught sight of the scarred man, Crenshaw by his gait and the twisted scar along his jaw, directing the attack with calculated cruelty. Every move of his men seemed choreographed, meant to overwhelm. But we had the advantage of knowing the land, knowing every ridge, every trough. Dixie ducked behind the water trough, signaling me with a sharp nod toward a hollowed-out embankment that gave us a defensive angle. The fight stretched over the yard like a predator circling prey. Bullets kicked up dirt, ricocheted off rails, and tore through the fences I had spent years building. I kept count of rounds and men, heart in my throat with every movement. Dixie never faltered, never wavered. Each shot she took was precise, measured, her calm contrast to the storm around us. Then I saw him, Crenshaw, moving to flank us, eyes glittering with malice. I realized then that we were no longer just defending our land. We were holding the war line for justice itself, for the truth she carried and for the people he would destroy if left unchecked. My pulse raced, my hand steady, as I loaded another round. The choice clear. We either stand together now, or we die divided. The sun dipped, low, burning the horizon red, and Crenshaw's men pressed harder, thinking the dying light gave them the advantage. But it was Dixie and me who had the advantage. Knowledge, precision, and resolve that only comes from fighting for more than yourself. We moved like shadows along the embankments, taking positions we had planned in the quiet tension of the afternoon. Every step, every breath was measured, every heartbeat a warning. Dixie's eyes met mine, a silent signal that the time had come. We couldn't hold them forever. We had to end this. With a nod, she fired the first shot, dropping the lead rider and creating the chaos we needed. I pressed forward, taking careful aim at a man trying to flank us from the ridge. Each gunshot echoed across the valley, carrying with it the certainty of vengeance and survival. Crenshaw appeared last, his scar twisting into a grin that didn't reach his eyes. He thought he could intimidate, but we had learned his patterns, his overconfidence, his weakness for spectacle. Dixie drew him into the trap, luring him toward the hollow creek bed where I had set a hidden line of fire. The exchange was deadly, fast and precise. Bullets tore through the dry earth, sparks flying as they struck rocks, and I realized how close we were to the edge of everything. Crenshaw lunged, revolver raised, aiming for Dixie. But she pivoted with a fluidity born of countless battles, and I fired. My shot struck him square in the shoulder, making him stumble, giving Dixie the opening she needed to disarm him completely. The remaining men saw their leader fall, and with panic in their eyes, dropped their weapons or tried to flee into the shadows. The field was ours. The wind carried the acrid smell of smoke and spent gunpowder, and for the first time in days, I felt a quiet that wasn't threatened. Dixie, breathing heavily, wiped her brow and looked at me. In that moment, it wasn't just survival, it was victory, hard-won, earned by courage and trust. The dust settled, and silence stretched over the land like a heavy blanket. Crenshaw and his men were captured, disarmed and bound. Their reign of terror ended by the careful orchestration of Dixie and the knowledge I had of this land. Federal marshals arrived shortly after, taking the criminals into custody, their faces grim as they recognized the scope of the corruption we'd exposed. Over 24 arrests had already been made across the neighboring territories, and the stolen cattle were being returned to their rightful owners. Justice wasn't just delivered, it was undeniable. Dixie and I stood on the porch of my cabin, surveying the quiet hills that had been ours alone for only a moment. Her hand found mine, fingers intertwined in a way that no words could replicate. The adrenaline that had fueled every shot, every choice began to ebb, replaced with the warmth of something far rarer: peace. She had carried the burden of the truth, of danger, across states and into my life, and now, finally, we could let it rest. Weeks passed. The marshals departed, leaving us with letters of commendation and a promise that the law would follow through with the trials. Dixie recovered from the minor wounds she'd sustained, her strength intact, her resolve unshaken. And we built slowly. Not walls, not defenses, but fences, gardens, routines that spoke of life uninterrupted by fear. Each day the cabin became a home. Each sunrise a reminder that survival had meaning beyond fighting. I looked at her one evening as she tended to the small garden behind the cabin, sunlight glinting off her hair and catching the flecks of gold in her eyes. She smiled at me, and in that moment I realized the letters I had once sent to a woman named Margaret had brought me something infinitely better. Not a stranger, not a fantasy, but a partner who had chosen to fight beside me, and then, when the guns were silent, to stay. We didn't need adventure anymore. We had trust, loyalty, and a home forged not from the absence of danger, but from the courage to face it together. And as the sun set behind the hills, casting long shadows over the land, I knew that whatever storms might come, we would meet them side by side, strong, steady, and unafraid. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe and click on the video on your screen now to dive into another unforgettable Western adventure. Trust me, the Wild West has plenty more tales where danger, loyalty, and courage collide in ways you never expect.